Greetings, greetings. So we are doing here the baking unit, and I want to stress, as I have in the classroom, and I always say when we're doing this unit, we are barely skimming the surface of this content. When it comes to baking and pastry arts, there is really so much that you could delve into. Just this concept of ingredient function that we're going to be covering today is something that I could cover in an entire semester class. There are a lot of experiments, there's a lot of different baking that can happen just covering this one concept. So I'm going to actually be going through this in the classroom. But for students that are doing this virtually or are absent on that day, this will serve for the instruction. I'm going to make this video into two part one and part two. So you'll have two videos to kind of stop and review, but these will be a little longer than normal. When it comes to what we're actually doing, so we're going to be filling out these guided notes actually as we go in class. So I might toggle back and forth a little bit here to kind of help guide you along. And I'm actually going to keep the presentation on the screen in the format in which you have it linked to. And one of the things that I want to stress here is that you can toggle back and forth, but we also have notes at the bottom. So at the bottom of all my presentation, there is kind of typed in the information that you would hear me say actually in class and instruction. And that is a really good resource to use for review. So our very first, I'm going to make it just a little bit bigger here though, because I do want to focus more on you being able to see this part of my screen as opposed to the notes, but you do have access to those notes. So the first thing we're going to talk about here are the categories of baker's ingredients. When it comes to baked goods, regardless of what type of baked goods you're making, if you're making cookies, if you're making cake, if you're making bread, brownies, most all of these baked goods come down to these same ingredients. What really differs and what makes the difference between brownies or cookies or a cake are the amount of these ingredients that you utilize. So one may include more fat, more liquid, less flour than the other, and then ultimately that is what determines your final baked good product. So your categories of baker's ingredients are strengtheners. These provide your structure. Without a strengthener, you have nothing. You have a mess on your pan. Fats and shortenings, and these are butters and oils. And there is a wide variety. Sometimes they are interchangeable, sometimes they are not. If you are making certain baked goods, you can't always use vegetable oil in place of butter, can't always use butter in place of oil. So that really is going to determine the final product that you use. Sweeteners would be sugars and syrups. There are artificial ones and there are natural ones. Each one does a different, has a different purpose in that baked good and will ultimately also determine the final product. So for leaveners, when it comes to leaveners, there are three different types, and leaveners essentially come down to things that make your baked good puff and rise. That's your basic use there. Thickeners, essentially thickeners, they make things get thicker. They take something that is a liquid and turn it into a semi-solid or sometimes even a solid. So that's a thickener would be the difference between Jello or Kool-Aid, for example. Flavorings are going to add flavor. That's pretty self-explanatory. Liquids are going to moisten your batter, and they will come into play in the science of the baked goods. And then in the end, you have some additives. And additives generally do not change the overall baked good as far as the product and the texture and what you're actually making. The additives usually are just a texture or a flavor additive. So candy, nuts, food coloring, but you're still going to get the same cookie with or without that additive. So when we're talking about strengtheners, moving on. So if you are following along as far as the guided notes go, we would be down here moving past the strengtheners. You should have filled out this top part with the basic function. So when we're looking at the strengtheners, these are structure and support. Your main one is flour. The most commonly used flour is going to be wheat flour. And so wheat flour is the most common. You hear a term in when it comes to people's health, and the term is gluten. So gluten is a protein that is found in flour. And when that flour granule, which is dry, has liquid added to it, the flour absorbs that liquid, it expands, and that protein, that gluten, is released. And then you mix it and you knead it and you work it, and the dough becomes more sticky and more sticky. And what happens is that gluten is developed. For some products, and we learned this when we made muffins, you don't want to mix very much. If you mix very much at all, then the gluten is developed, your dough becomes sticky, and your muffin can become tough. Pancakes, waffles, almost all your quick breads, you have to be very careful. And that's why the muffin method of mixing that we may have covered in class already is important to note. You barely pull that together. When you use yeast, on the other hand, which I'll talk about here in a moment, probably in part two, then you do want gluten development. And so the science of gluten, when to mix, when not to mix, what is it, is going to come into play. Non-wheat flours, there are several different options. Almond flour, coconut flour, even oat flour has some gluten. Some people cannot eat gluten because their body cannot process it. So there is a disease called celiac disease, and the consumption of gluten will mess people up really bad. Some people are intolerant to it. So eating gluten or a certain amount of gluten can cause gestational distress, but it's not going to kill them or make them deathly ill. For pretty much for everybody else in the world, consuming gluten does not harm you, and consuming something that is gluten free is not a healthier product. It only means that it doesn't contain that particular protein. So if your body doesn't have an intolerance to the gluten protein, then there's no reason for you to not consume it. So those are strengtheners, and those would be flours. So when you look at different types of flours, let me move my picture over here. So when we look at different types of flour, the most common flour that we are going to be talking about and dealing with is the wheat flour and all-purpose flour. So this has medium gluten content, not a lot, not a little. It'll support almost all your products. You'll still get a delicate cookie and cake, and you'll also still be able to make bread that has yeast in it. When you raise that gluten content, you have more gluten content than you have bread flour. So bread flour is pretty self-explanatory, and it makes a stronger, heartier roll. It supports yeast a little bit better, and you want to utilize that when making bread. Cake flour, on the other hand, has less gluten in it, and you're going to get a more delicate product. If you're trying to make bread out of cake flour, then you may find that you don't have the support for your yeast development. So these three flours here are the most common that you're going to find at the grocery store or in most of your common baking recipes. And ultimately, the difference between cake and bread is gluten content. It all comes down to how strong it's going to be. The next type of flours, which are a little bit less common that you may find when you get into more advanced baking, would be durum flour. This is a harder wheat flour. It has a higher gluten content. This is also utilized for breads. Pastry flour. Pastry flour is utilized for cookies, pies, pastries, sweet things. This has somewhere in between kind of cake and all-purpose, and it is mostly used more for pastries. And then semolina, which is a type of durum, so it is related to that. It is more coarsely ground, but it has kind of it's usually used in pastas and Italian pastries. So when you go and buy spaghetti or pasta at the store and you look on the package, it generally says made with semolina flour. So this is going to have a higher gluten content than what you normally would utilize. You can make some flour with or you can make some pasta with all-purpose, but it's not going to turn out very well. And if you really want it to not break and to get that nice structure, then you really need to utilize that pasta flour. Let's pause.